welcome back. All right, so today we have an easier one, right? We're not going into something as advanced as Carl Friston's work in the moral engine, etc., and like deep mathematics. Today we're going to go over something because believe it or not, I do try to make things for the general public, right? The idea is for my systems to have effect, right? So I came through the Western systems we have that don't operate towards flourishing, right? And I felt the effects of that firsthand. I saw it amongst many people that I love and care for throughout my work and my life. So the four buckets is a diagnostic model of wealth, power, and moral structure, right? Basically, it takes all of economics and distills it down as something that everyone can kind of understand. And everyone has an intuition of these things, but it's not super easy to like put them into words, right? So the abstract, I'm going to leave this here for like 2 seconds because no one cares. And then I'm going to move on. You can pause if you're interested in the abstract. All right. Introduction. Most economic analysis quantifies value but does not evaluate its moral origin. Who benefits? Who pays? What is built? What is destroyed? These are the moral questions dressed up in economic clothing. The four buckets model cuts through euphemism and ideology by categorizing all value activity into four distinct archetypes: creators, manipulators, extractors, and parasites, right? Pretty easy concepts to understand. So creation, that's the first bucket. This is the bucket that we want to be in, all right? So it's the hardest bucket to do because you have to actually produce value where none existed before. That's innovation, craftsmanship, service, healing, cultivation, right? Examples are teachers, coders, farmers, doctors, small business owners, caregivers, moral leaders, right? These are people who are creating value. The moral signature is sacrifice, effort, delayed gratification, right? Things that our society does not really promote anymore, but are unbelievably necessary when you're trying to operate to reduce suffering and increase flourishing. The narrative function is the builders of coherence, right? These are the people who help raise other people and help build systems that or help participate in systems that allow people to have food, to be educated, to have apps and to extend the reach that people have. It also anchors long-term flourishing, right? So it's like these people will not by themselves create long-term flourishing, but it is remarkably important to have a foundation of people who actually are creating value. Value is not money. Money is a pseudo way of tracking value, right? And it worked for some period of time, but every system of tracking value is gameable. All right, second bucket is manipulation, right? Shaping perception to drive behavior. So you can serve or you can distort through manipulation, but nonetheless, it is still manipulation. So this is advertising, branding, UI, UX, optimizations, persuasion, lobbying, right? This is a bucket that you need to be very careful at if you work within this, right? So if you're shaping other people's perception to drive behavior, you could be doing so as part of the civil rights movement was doing that, right? That was shaping perception to drive behavior. But advertising and lobbying are also things like that. So we have to be very careful. And branding and targeting children, right? Things like what Roblox does. This can go bad fast. There's very few modern good actors in the manipulation bucket. Extraction. This is where a majority of the Western economic systems exist, right? Taking value from a system without reinvesting it within the system. Examples are landlords charging exploitative rent, hedge funds, gaming crises, corporations lobbying for tax loopholes, even individuals lobbying for tax loopholes. So the idea is that these people believe they deserve a larger piece of the pie, and they're going to use exploitation to be able to get a larger piece of that pie. We're also talking about the contracts that go out to the military and how they go to a very low number of organizations that get to benefit from billions of dollars that essentially just continues moving what some might call our economic engine, but really it's just the war engine, which has become almost a replacement for a large portion of our economic system. Parasitism, right? Creating harm while appearing to provide value, right? Examples are scam influencers, pyramid schemes, corrupt nonprofits, some AI products, political grifters, right? So the idea here is you act like you're creating value, but you're actually extracting, right? So this is kind of almost underneath the bucket of extraction, but we need to move away from parasitism and extraction completely. We need to, like, cryptocurrency, all of this kind of stuff, all the ads that you get on YouTube about courses, like this within society needs to be like socially cut out, right, as a norm. We're not doing parasitism, we're not doing extraction. Those are not ways to create flourishing. Those are ways to take from a large portion of people where you're spreading out the cost across a lot of people so they feel it less. Although I would say that today we feel the damage of parasitism and extraction more than ever because the middle class has been almost squished out. There is no middle class right now. The myth is that living in working poverty is middle class, right? And it's like you don't have to go back very far to see that you actually used to be able to generate wealth. Just 50 years ago, you could buy a home and actually save money and have investments and things like this without having it only come from employer contributions in your retirement account that may never actually actualize because you have to live until probably like 70 plus to get those nowadays. All right. Key predictions of the model, right? Concentration of power follows parasitic density. The more parasitic a system becomes, the more it centralizes influence in those who contribute the least and extract the most. So all of our current systems are built on this concept. And you'll see a lot of people try to blame it on the patriarchy, they try to blame it on white people, etc. This is the mechanic. Don't get fooled by all of these distractions. If the people using this happen to be male or happen to be white, that's irrelevant to the actual problem, right? And then you start creating these pseudo wars that never actually address the real issue, right? Dyeing the color of people's skin doesn't change how concentration of power follows parasitic density. Replacing white people doing this with black people doing this is the exact same system, right? Or any other race of people. Replacing men doing this with women doing this is the exact same situation, right? I don't really advocate for colorblindness as a concept when you're dealing with people, but when you're dealing with systems, if your system doesn't work for everyone, regardless of their demographics, their race, their class, etc., then your system doesn't work, right? The whole point is that this is not a system of zero-sum games. We've made it a concentration of power following parasitic density, which is a zero-sum game. But there's no need for it to be a zero-sum game. We have excess resources. We have excess human capital that is wasted and not really truly utilized to its fullest potential. And human capital is probably the most important driver in history towards flourishing. Narrative camouflage increases with moral decay, right? So the more we as people lose our morality, our traditions, our religious substrates, and we fall for these lies like maximizing stakeholder profit, which is the craziest idea that they have sold us on, right? The idea like, well, no, rich people deserve, because stakeholders are going to be people who have wealth and excess wealth to be able to invest, right? And the idea that people who already have deserve for systems to be constrained and built purposely for them to continue to flourish at the cost of the people who do not have additional and excess wealth is insane. It doesn't make any sense. So once again, it's a lie, but the way the left and people who kind of try to come at this problem, they come from the wrong directions at the wrong actors, right? So they usually make it some sort of identity-based game. They make it a game about corporations are the problem. It's like, no. The actual incentives are the problem, right? Corporations are just following the the system of laws that we have placed. So we have to get rid of concepts like fiduciary responsibility to a stakeholder, right? That doesn't mean that you can just burn money like crazy. What it means is that you should be held to a much better and I would say higher standard, but that's debatable, of not using tactics that move the cost of flourishing from the people who are flourishing onto another group. And historically, that's what we do. Because when resources are limited, the world is a zero-sum game. When we were in tribes, when we were still, 5, 10,000, 20,000 years ago, yes, there was no possibility of being able to have global flourishing at that time. But we've removed the barriers for those things. And now what we have is models that are going to keep us from actualizing flourishing. So I wrote some stuff here. We got as system becomes parasitic, their public narratives grow more virtuous, right? They're going to tell you why the horrible things they're doing are actually really good for you, right? And humans operate based on narratives. Everything is a conceptual narrative, either yourself or the way you look at other people, right? When somebody asks you who you are, you give them a narrative of who you are, because that's how we concept everything, right? So it's like, I am an honest, hardworking father, who cares about his community. That's the narrative. And narratives can easily be abused, and that's what systems of power and control do. So CSR initiatives, branding campaigns, and token donations serve as moral cover. So the reality is, when you look at the things that we call charity, right, the way that they're run is extractive. You know what I mean? Like delivering less than 10% of the money that is given to the purpose of the money is unacceptable. You know what I mean? But that's normal in charities, because we have people who are running charities as their full-time job. That's a bad model, right? You could run charities off of volunteer contributions and minimal staffing, right? You do have to have some level of like regulatory oversight and like financial oversight. But the reality is, we don't do that, even though there's plenty of people who want to do good for the world and would be willing to do it for free, right? But instead we create more opportunities to extract from the money that we've already given, right? So that we can say, well, no, we create jobs within our charity. That's really important. It's like, well, we can create jobs in other areas where it doesn't have to have a conflicting interest, right, with flourishing and helping people. Flourishing correlates with creator density, right? So the more you have people who create, and not only do you have creators of, creators like teachers, etc., you have people who invent, right? The biggest movers are giant leaps forward in either structural creation or in the printing press, like, actual inventions. Discoveries, right? Electricity, and then actualizing the electricity into light bulbs and things of that sort, right? We have done an unbelievably good job of expanding through creation and invention the possibilities in the scope of what humans can do. But yet, morally, we've moved in the opposite direction, right? So we've allowed more exploitative strategies and concepts as we've driven more and more streamlined approaches, right? This is why different types of monopolies, all of a sudden came out in the 1800s, and we were like, whoa, this is a problem, right? And so then we limit those things, and then new things come along that don't follow the same exact scripts, right? So people are like, do we have to break Alphabet up? Do we have to break Meta up? These companies are so much larger and much more powerful than those monopolies from the 1800s ever could have dreamed of being. But yet they still persist. They still somehow make it through all of these lawsuits. They get broken up into these subsidiaries, but it doesn't actually change the overarching power structure of how they're able to operate and sell data. Individuals and communities dominated by bucket one activities show higher psychological resilience, agency, and health. When it comes to education, instead of teaching people how to be cogs, right, how to operate within an existing machine, we need to teach children the ability to use volitional audit, which is the idea of thinking about your worldview and your actions and your concepts and whether or not they align with the outcomes that you want to have, and then adjusting them. This uses neuroplasticity, right? And also critical thinking, right? Which is you need critical thinking to be able to actualize any attempt at volitional audit. So we teach children and put the wrong structures as incentives. We use these barbaric, like Soviet tactics of sitting kids in classrooms, etc. We've gotten a little bit better in recent times as my children are going through school, but we're still focusing on the wrong areas, right? Like being able to read is awesome, don't get me wrong, right? Even though reading is going downhill, right? So we're not really doing so great with that. Having basic math comprehension skills is valuable, don't get me wrong, right? Learning history is valuable. But all of these things are being taught through a lens of how to fit within an existing architecture, not questioning architecture and questioning the values. So when you get older and you have a set worldview, it's more costly to you and your narrative structure and your worldview to reassess and to change. So these tools need to be given to like 10 to 12-year-olds when you're first formulating a real solid worldview. That's why they kind of buck back at their parents between the ages of like 10 and 15 based on maturity. And what you want is you want to create people who are independent thinkers. And people who are independent thinkers all the time complain about how stupid people are and how they're just cog, blah, blah. That's what we train people to be. It's not the fault of the people that are properly oriented and operating in the system the way that they're told to operate. And it does make people easier to control, but is that what we want? Do we want the existing class of power structures, right? Which don't need to have some shadowy organization. They just need to have incentives, and that's what they have, right? And do we want them to stay in power by having systems that, whether purposely or not, it doesn't matter, they have created a very easily controlled environment, right? And once you add in algorithmic issues and social media and all these problems, the lack of critical thinking in relational audit makes it so it's almost impossible for people to operate ethically properly. They're going to fall into all of these psychological traps, etc., because they don't have the skills to be able to navigate them. So if we can move to a world where we want to build future creators. Now, not everybody is going to invent things, and that's fine, but you give them the skills to be able to operate on base levels of abstraction, and then the ones who do have the ability, because history is always written on the back of a few, right? On our Newtons and our Darwins and our Einsteins, etc., right? And there's way more people, but the concept is the same, right? You have like, is it Moore's law and Price's law? You know, they basically kind of point to the same ideas, which is that very few are the ones who the rest of society benefits from, and what the rest of society is supposed to do is act cohesively with each other and not have too much crime, too much violence, too much risk, so that the people who are doing the pushing forward can continue to do that for humanity. Manipulation becomes, all right, manipulation becomes dangerous when paired with extraction, right? So once you have manipulation and extraction, now you have something that people, like I said, don't have the skills to be able to deal with, right? We're not trained to be able to spot manipulative tactics, and we're not trained to question extraction, because extraction is built on narratives of creating value. I create jobs, etc. And if I do that, then you can't question me. Are you going to take away those people's jobs? That brings up the idea that there could never be a possible replacement job, that as soon as you disappear from the market, that there's not going to be, in a free market, someone or something to rise and replace that position, but they might just not use extractive tactics. So we need to make that the norm, right? Through social pressures and regulation, not through, well, hopefully someday through laws, but not through force is the important thing. Like, these all have to be, and concentrations of power will continue to use force to try to oppress you, while you have to morally use tactics that do not use force. Unless, of course, you live in an environment where, like, it is a totalitarian state and you have to use violence. But we live in the West. That's not actually something that we can use as an excuse to use violence in return. So practical applications, personal audit, right? Which bucket do your daily actions serve? What percentage of your income comes from each, right? Recognize where you are in the system. It is not on you that you happen to be an insurance broker and you live and work in an extractive system. What it is for you to recognize, I live in an extractive system. What are my responsibilities to limit the abusive parts of this extractive system where they become manipulative and parasitic? Organizational design. What is your company's bucket distribution? How do incentives reward each one, right? If you follow incentives, you will find outcomes. People and things follow processes and incentives and rules of natural law. That's just how it works. I wish my cats weren't fighting right next to me. All right. Policy application. Fight for laws that support creators, that expose parasites, and that restrict extraction maxed as productivity. There's many examples of this, but things like lobbying just cannot be a thing, right? Money needs to be kept out of politics because even without money, there's so much power in politics that you don't need a single incentive to make it so that everyone is always going to want to go after that power, right? But at least limiting the ways that people are able to benefit off of that. Ideas like being able to trade off of insider information from being a lawmaker is insane and unacceptable. That is a parasitic, tactic, and people have made billions off of it. So, policy advocacy, yeah, really important. AI ethics, right? We need to align LLMs and AI tools towards creator support, not manipulative short-term goals, such as attention and engagement, right? Which is currently what they're modeled for. So once again, we'll go back to the limits of the model, okay? Simplicity. The model is not a full economic theory. It simplifies a multidimensional world into 4 lenses, right? But it does a really good job of doing that, especially for people who never took an economics course or anything, right? You're just living your life and you don't understand why everything seems rigged against you because incentives are. Role of overlap. One action can span buckets. A manipulative ad that funds a real creator is a mixed signal. Mr. Beast does this all the time, right? It's really hard to say if Mr. Beast is an extractor or if he is a creator. He uses manipulative tactics and sometimes looks like a parasite, right? This whole water thing, using social pressure to get people to donate money to build wells in third world countries, etc. It's really hard to morally wrap your head around those things. Like, the outcome of building the wells is flourishing. That's great for humanity. The precedent of socially pressuring people to donate is not great. The fact that Mr. Beast gets to make millions off of doing something that is good is extraction. But the amount of extraction that is allowed within a system is kind of relational to your output, right? So, and this is the argument that billionaires make, etc. But the issue is that no one generates billions of dollars by themselves of value, right? You have to use non-creator tactics, such as the other 3 buckets, in order to generate that much money. You probably could make $100 million off of something that is remarkably transformative, in the world. But the reality is, even the people who make like the crazy big moves, like whoever created the internet, is not a billionaire. But the internet has created more value for people than Elon Musk ever will, right? So it's like, well, you can make arguments if we get to Mars and if we survive an asteroid impact. There's arguments, but the reality is that the internet has been one of the best poverty reduction tools that ever existed. Role of overlap. I already covered that. Moral bias. It reflects a normative stance, right? That flourishing and generative effort are good. If you reject this, then the model loses grip, right? So if you don't believe that reducing suffering and increasing human flourishing, right, and that creating things are good, right, then definitionally you're not going to agree with this. So there is a moral bias. Context dependence, right? Historical and cultural settings shift the lines between extraction and creation. That's moral here, may not be moral there. That's a timescale issue. Some people, actually most people, believe in an objective morality. They just don't agree on the same objective morality, right? Religions post objective moralities, right? The work I do with the Moral Engine posts a objective morality, right? Moral relativism creates destruction, right? In any model, you can just think about it or you can simulate it. Moral relativism causes everything to fall apart because you have to have a system of hierarchy and value, right? The problem is getting people to agree on those things. I believe we have biological strategies and incentives, and that those biological strategies and incentives play out as like archetypes, if you're a fan of Jung, and that those archetypes essentially is what correlates morality. And morality, therefore, could be measured through the FEP as prediction, error minimization. Anyway, I went longer than I planned to. This was supposed to be a short video, but nothing I ever do can really be a short video. I hope you enjoy and stay in the community to learn and talk about more. If you have your own models and your own thoughts, I'm interested in always learning and always expanding my understanding of